Now, there's a couple of principles that I want to show on here.
Oh,
Klalva, it's K-H, Homer.
Elizabeth.
Klalva Homer is a ancient Jewish rabbinic principle, okay? And it's going to make things seem...
Oh, that's perfect.
It's going to open up things to this passage. Now, what that meant is light and heavy, okay?
Light?
Light, L-I-G-H-T, as in not so heavy, and then heavy. And what it is reasoning from the lesser to the greater. It was during the time of Jesus, and he used it himself. He was a rabbi. And here's what I mean. He said, does not God care for the sparrows, right? Mm-hmm. He says, and his reasoning was, well, if he cares for the sparrows, which was probably one of the least of all the animals and the smallest, cheapest sacrifice you could bring, will he not also care for you? You see what I'm saying? The reasoning from the lighter to the greater. Another principle that they had was pikuach nefesh, which means preservation of life, or more literally, preservation of the soul. What that is, now, last time I did this, someone thought I was teaching heresy when I said this. But when you had two laws that conflicted with each other, heresy alert. Is that possible, to have two God's laws conflict with each other?
No.
No. Actually, it is. And Jesus gave the example. He said, because they exalted the Sabbath so much, he said this. He said, which of you having an ox or a donkey that falls into a ditch, right? Mm-hmm. Will you not pull them out on the Sabbath day? Mm. Now, let me ask you this. Would it take a lot of work to do that?
Yeah.
I would think so. But you'd have to violate the Sabbath.
Right.
So you see two laws conflicting, right? Not that God made it on purpose, but then they came up with another principle, preservation of life. In other words, life is exalted in the Bible, okay? They saw that in the Torah. It talks about how important life was. If you could save a life, all right, because and actually violate the Sabbath, you're not breaking the Sabbath. All right, now let me give you an example. This is going to hit home. Okay, suppose the New World Order comes to Donnie's house, and they're looking for Mariah and Florence. Okay, and I even got an example for you. And then Donnie is hiding them in like a, floorboard or something underneath. He's dug a hole, right? They say, where are they? And you reply, I don't know. You just lied, right? Mm-hmm. And it says in Revelation, all liars' part will be in the lake of fire. Did you sin?
Of course.
No, you didn't. You didn't sin. Because you just had one law supersede another law.
Preservation of life.
Preservation of life. And I would tell you, I'll even read you a passage that confuses people. Remember back when they were in Egypt, the children of Israel, and the Egyptian midwives were told, if it's a boy that's born, throw him into the Nile River, right?
Yeah.
Okay. The midwives weren't doing that. And then they were brought before Pharaoh. And this is Exodus 1:19. The midwives said to Pharaoh, they gave their excuse, because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before we can get to them. They lied. Now, let's see what God's reaction is, okay? Verse 20. So God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very mighty. Because the midwives feared God, he established households for them. So God blesses them. It sounds like he's blessing their lives, right? But remember, there's a law of life that supersedes the other law of lying. So if it's to preserve life or save life, when they come, you can say, no, I don't know where they are. Or like the Jews in World War II when the Nazis came, right? And a lot of them were hiding them. They lied and said, no, there's nobody here. And so looking at that, I would say, yeah, they didn't sin before God. In fact, God was pleased with what they did. Okay? So now you kind of understand that principle?
Kind of do.
Yes.
Is that God's law or the Jews' law?
No, they saw two laws. One was you don't lie. We know that one, right?
Yeah.
Okay, the other law was, and there's other things that talk about life and how important it is in the Torah. So they said, well, there comes a time when laws will conflict. And so if you lie in order to preserve life, the greater law supersedes the lesser, light and heavy. Okay?
I got you.
So so that was a principle they got from light and heavy, which was the preservation of life. And we're going to see it come into play here. So these are just Jewish principles that they had at the time of Jesus. Now, remember, at that time, Pharisaic Judaism, not the Torah, not the law, it was Pharisaic Judaism. It was their interpretation of the law, the Jews, where they kept putting laws up, to preserve laws and laws to preserve those laws and on and on.
Right.
Okay? And so this is chapter 6, verse 1. Now it happened that as he, that's Yeshua, was passing through some grain fields on the Sabbath, his disciples were picking the heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands, and eating the grain. Verse 2. But some of the Pharisees said, why do you do what is not lawful on the Sabbath? Now here's my question. Was that lawful on the Sabbath? It says in Deuteronomy 23:25, when you enter your neighbor's standing grain, then you may pluck the heads with your hand, but you shall not wield a sickle in your neighbor's standing grain. In other words, you can go to the corner of the fields, pass through it, and you can hand pick them. Okay? But you can't go in there with a big old, sickle and start harvesting his grain. Okay, which makes sense. Is God just caring for the people of Israel? And so was it lawful on the Sabbath? Yes, it was. But with all their many laws that they added to the law, they said, yeah, that actually is reaping, picking it, and then getting off the chaff like that. That was threshing, and then actually eating it was storing the grain.
Oh my God.
I know.
And that just got out of hand.
Yeah, it's like you couldn't spit on the Sabbath.
Yeah.
Why? Because if that spit hit the ground and kind of went forward a little bit, it'd make a little indention, a little ditch, and you were plowing.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
You couldn't wear your dentures
Talk about
on
extreme.
the Sabbath because you were bearing a burden. Did God make the Sabbath for a blessing?
No.
For rest.
For rest, yes.
Yeah.
So originally it was for rest.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a good thing. But by the time the Pharisees were done, they made it a burden.
Wow.
Because you had to worry, am I doing this right? Am I doing that right? Am I doing this right? Am I doing that right? Why is Sunday kind of considered the Sabbath? Well, some people say, well, Jesus was resurrected on that day, and thus the Christian church made that the Sabbath. Misunderstanding what the Sabbath is. Does the Sabbath mean that's the day you have church and worship?
No.
No. If you understand the Sabbath, it means rest.
Right.
So the church is so mixed up, it's saying, oh, Sunday is the Sabbath now. That's the Christian Sabbath, and it's supposed to be the day that you worship. So we make mistake upon mistake. But the Sabbath is what it was back then and what it is now. It's what it was in Genesis 1 is what it is now. From sundown Friday till sundown Saturday. Okay? Very simple. Very simple. All right? So we get things mixed up. So the Sabbath hasn't changed. Has not changed. All right. So they're asking him, why are you doing what's not lawful on the Sabbath? Now, Jesus, I suppose, could have replied, well, you guys just made up those rules. But instead, he uses an interesting illustration that throws people off. And Jesus answered, this is verse 3, and Jesus answering them said, have you not read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and took and ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for any to eat except the priest alone, and gave it to his companions. This is when David was running from Saul. All right. So he came across the priests. They had the showbread out. And only the priests were allowed to eat that. All right. But then he ate it and his men with him. So did he break the law? They did not break the law. Jesus, that's the whole reason Jesus is quoting this. Is because he's showing you can do things and not break the law. In other words, there's a greater law than the priest eating the showbread. You know what it was? Human need. Human need. David and his men were hungry. So what Jesus is showing us is, yes, and the law is kindness and compassion. And in fact, when you had the Sabbath, that was a radical concept in that society, because not only did you rest, your animals rested. And slaves in other cultures were worked 7 days a week. Can you imagine that? Working 7 days a week from sunup to sundown? Oh my gosh. And so, he in verse 5, and he was saying, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. All right. So the big thing you're going to find here when you really look at it is there's a conflict throughout the Gospels, and that is the Sabbath. In fact, at that time, they had a great debate. Which was the most important law, to keep the Sabbath or to love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind, soul, and strength?
To love the Lord your God with all your
Jesus answered it.
Mm-hmm.
He was saying it would, and in fact, so it's to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Remember the lawyer came up and said, what's the greatest law? Because at that time, there was that debate, the Sabbath. That's why the Sabbath keeps coming up. Because to many Jews, that was the most important law. All right? And so, and the Jews had a saying, you ready? This, and see if you can think of what scripture this is. They had a saying back then. They said, the Sabbath was not made for Israel, but Israel was made for the Sabbath. In other words, the reason God created Israel was to keep the Sabbath. The Sabbath was so important, he had to create Israel so it could be kept. Jesus turns it around and says what? Do you remember? He says that man was not made for the Sabbath, but Sabbath was made for man. In other words, God didn't just create man to keep the Sabbath. He made the Sabbath to benefit man. Do you see what I'm saying? So when you understand all the conflicts and stuff that were going on, you understand why Jesus said some of the things he did. Now, verse 6, on another Sabbath, happening on the Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching, and there was a man whose right hand was withered. All right? The scribes and the Pharisees were watching him closely to see if he healed on the Sabbath, so they might find reason to accuse him. So here's this poor guy, withered right hand. And they're putting him there probably as a trap for Jesus. And they're using this poor crippled guy. But you think they love this guy?
No.
Was it? No. And Jesus knew what they were thinking, and he said to the man with the withered hand, get up and come forward. And he got up and came forward. Now think about that. It's kind of like mine. Mine's the left arm, though. You know, get up and come forward. And the guy must be thinking, oh no, what's going to happen here, right? Mm-hmm. And Jesus said, I ask you, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or destroy it? So Sabbath became so burdensome that they couldn't do healing on the Sabbath. And in fact, see, like if Donnie lost his arm, I could still tend to him. I could do just enough to stop the blood flow so that he wouldn't die. But I couldn't promote healing on the Sabbath. Now, does that sound strange?
Yep.
That's ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's stupid. I could put a tourniquet around there, and you can stop the blood flow so he doesn't die, but I can't promote healing. It just got out of hand. And after looking around at them all, he said to them, stretch out your hand. And he did so, and his hand was restored. Now notice the guy has a withered hand. He can't stretch out his hand. Okay? So Jesus just told him to do the impossible. And the man obeyed, and it worked. Think about that. Now the Pharisees rejoiced greatly and realized that Jesus was the Messiah. That's the next verse, right? Oh, what does it say?
They were filled with madness.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Filled with rage and discussed together what they might do with Jesus. He just healed that man on the Sabbath. We need to get him. Oh my gosh. Organized religion gets so entangled in their own rules more than the Bible, okay, that this kind of stuff happens. All right? And I'm going to start naming churches right now. Okay? No, I'm not. I'm just teasing.
Churches, you can name governments.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that fit that. Okay. So now we see two confrontations on the Sabbath, right? And it's all to show us the setting that Jesus was in. But remember, there was a religious monopoly at that time. Now what you're going to find is the Pharisees are the prevalent group in the Gospels. And then when you switch to the book of Acts, it becomes the Sadducees. They become the ones in power. Okay, so you see a subtle little switch there. Verse 12, it was at that time that Jesus went off to the mountain to pray, and he spent the whole night in prayer to God. Now here is God himself, the Son of God, praying all night to God the Father. Is there a reason why? Well, verse 13, and when day came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them. And he also named them as apostles. Okay? So he had a lot of disciples, and we could be disciples today. There's only 12 apostles. All right? And there's a lot of clowns running around claiming that they're apostles. Well, that's kind of hard because Jesus told them they would sit on the 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Kind of keeps it at 12, doesn't it? Yeah, it sure does. Okay. Here's the apostles, Simon, whom he also named Peter, and Andrew, his brother. Remember when he first came to the fishing boat, who was there? Simon and Andrew.
Yep.
And then they had two partners, and they were James and John, the next two. And so some people say this is the order of their importance. Philip and Bartholomew, Matthew, okay, who wrote the Gospel of Matthew and Thomas, James, the son of Alphaeus, and Simon, who is also called the Zealot, Judas, the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. Isn't it funny? Both Judases are at the end of the list. But there's only one Judas Iscariot that is the traitor. There's another guy there that was named Judas, okay? So you see the difference? And look in verse 15, you have Matthew called Levi. And what was his occupation?
Tax collector.
Okay. In that same verse, you have Simon, who is also called the Zealot. Two different people. One was Matthew, who was a tax collector, who was a traitor, hated by the Jewish people. And you had Simon the Zealot, a radical patriot who wanted to overthrow the Roman government. Now, normally, if you put Matthew and Simon in the same room, guess what? Matthew would be dead. He wouldn't get out of that alive. All right? Because you have one guy who would be carrying around a dagger and use it whenever he could to help overthrow Rome, and then you had this traitor there. So I find that kind of ironic. Verse 17. Jesus came down with them and stood on a level place, and there was a large crowd of his disciples and a great throng of people from all Judea and Jerusalem and the coastal region of Tyre and Sidon, who came to hear him and be healed of their diseases, and those who were troubled with unclean spirits were being cured. And all the people were trying to touch him, for the power was coming from him and healing them. Now this is what we call the Sermon on the Mount. It's most famous in Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. Okay? Now, what is the Sermon on the Mount? Does that apply today? Okay, within the context of Jesus coming to offer the millennial kingdom, and the church is not even on the table, Does this apply to the Christian church today? I know, it makes you think, huh? I'll give you what I think. All right? Some call this the Constitution or the Manifesto of the Kingdom. In other words, he's here to present the kingdom, the millennial kingdom, the messianic kingdom, okay? And as such, he's given the manifesto or the law of the kingdom. And that's here. Now, anytime God gives like you have the Old Testament law of the Torah,
Yeah.
but then once Christianity starts, you have, according to James, the king's law of the royal law, which now governs us, right? We're not under Old Testament law. Paul makes that clear.
Right.
But is there any crossover? In other words, in the Old Testament it says, do not murder. Does it mean it's okay to murder now?
No.
No. There's certain moral principles that are always true. You see what I'm saying? Whether it's Old Testament Torah law or whether it's New Testament grace. It's always bad to murder. All right? So that's why on the Sermon on the Mount you can read a lot of things that could apply to us. But I think right here he's given the manifesto for the kingdom. Verse 20, and turning his gaze towards his disciples, he began to say, Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Now in Matthew, it says, Blessed are you who are poor in spirit, for yours is the kingdom of God. Which one's true? Is it blessed are the poor, or is it blessed are the poor in spirit? I think both are true. I think he said both. Now obviously, blessed are the poor in spirit because they realize they're bankrupt before God, right?
Right.
They have no standing. But listen to this from the book of James. James chapter 2, verses 5 and 6. He says, Listen, my beloved brethren, did not God choose the poor of this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom, whom he promised to those who love him? But ye have dishonored the poor man. Is it not the rich who oppress you and personally drag you into court? So he's not exalting being poor. He's just saying it's usually the poor people who are following God. So those who are poor in spirit are also, they tend to be at the bottom of society because they realize their need. And they're not chasing after riches. So you see how both could be true?
Yeah.
Now, it's not an absolute statement. Just because you're poor, you're not going to go to heaven. It's a general principle. Does that make sense? That usually poor people, but there are many poor people who are just as greedy as anyone, right?
Yeah.
And they're just as bad as anyone. But as a general rule throughout history, it's the poor people who have followed God. Blessed are you who hunger now, for you will be satisfied. Blessed are you who weep now, for you shall laugh. Now, here's my next question. It says in Matthew, Blessed are you who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Here he just says, Blessed are you who hunger. Which one is true?
Both.
Both. Because, again, it's that poor thing. You're hungry now. But it's also those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. So you see the point I'm making, right?
Right.
Okay. Now in verse 22. Blessed are you when men hate you and ostracize you and insult you and scorn your name as evil for the sake of the Son of Man. Now notice there's a reason why they're doing this. Okay? It's because you're being ridiculed and mocked for what?
For knowing Jesus.
For knowing Jesus. It's not just because you're an idiot or something.
Right.
Okay? It's because you're following God and they're mocking you. And you got to remember that. Verse 23, Be glad in that day and leap for joy. For behold, your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way their fathers used to treat the prophets. Okay? And here's what he says in Matthew 23, 29 through 33. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, If we had been living in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partner with them in the shedding of the blood of the prophets. Yeah, they're looking back now and say, oh, we wouldn't have done that. But listen, Jesus says, so you testify against yourself that you are the sons of those who murdered the prophets. Okay? To say you are, they have a saying in the Old Testament, son of Belial, or son of the devil, or son of foolishness. Okay, it just means that's your characteristic. And he's saying, oh, so you admit you're the sons of those murderers. In other words, that's you guys too. They killed the prophets, and guess who they're going to kill? Jesus. The ones that the prophets pointed to. He says, verse 32, fill up then the measure of your guilt of your fathers, you serpents, you brood of vipers. How shall you escape the sentence of hell? There's a principle here, is that don't expect any better treatment from the world than what the prophets got, okay, and what Jesus got. In Matthew 10, Jesus said, if they treat me this way, I'm the head of the household. What do you think they're going to do to you? Right? So if we're sitting here crying and weeping that they're treating me so bad. I had some more veiled threats against me yesterday. Okay? And all I got to say is God's telling me to rejoice. All right? In other words, if I wasn't threatened or put down every day, I would think I'm doing something wrong. Something's wrong with me. I'm not upsetting people. All right? Seriously.
As a Christian, we're supposed to be persecuted.
Yes. Okay. It says this, but woe to you who are rich, for you're receiving your, verse 24, but woe to you who are rich, for you're receiving your comfort in full. Woe to you who are well fed now, for you shall be hungry. Woe to you who laugh, for you shall weep and mourn. So again, kind of reinforcing that the hunger means real physical hunger and all that stuff, okay? And then 26, here's what you got to watch out for. Woe to you when all men speak well of you, for their fathers used to treat the false prophets in the same way. It was the false prophets that got all the accolades. And in fact, there's that one story in the Old Testament, I forgot to look it up, where they put the true prophet of God in a prison. And all the false prophets came around this king and they were saying, oh, go forth, king, and you are gonna, conquer this other guy. And one guy even made some horns and was going around saying, look, just like I'm, doing this, you're gonna do that to the enemy. And then the other king from Judah said, wait a minute, is there a real prophet of God here? He recognized that there's something fishy going on here. And so they bring that real prophet out, and he goes, oh yeah, king, go ahead, you're going to prosper. And then the king goes, would you just, stop fooling around, tell me the truth? Even he knew he was joking. And the guy said, yeah, you're going to go and you're not going to make it back alive. And he was the true prophet. So the true prophet was put in jail. The ones that said the nice, soft things, guess what? They were exalted and in the king's courts. Was it saying, Timothy, in the last days they shall accumulate for themselves teachers who will, anyone know?
False prophets.
False prophets who will tickle their ears. In other words, say what they want to hear. It's just a principle. God's people have been mistreated throughout the ages. Mm-hmm. Okay, and I think I got the reference about what happened to him. Verse 26, woe to you when all men speak well of you, for in the same way they used to treat the false prophets. This is Hebrews 11:36-38. It says, and others experience mocking, scourging, yes, chains and imprisonment.
Oh.
Talking about those who were serving God.
Wow.
Meanwhile, the false prophets, they were treated good. And here's verse 37. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. And I'm going to tell you who that was in a second. They were tempted. They were put to death with the sword. And they went about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, and ill-treated. They weren't living in the mansions. Men of whom, now listen to this. The world is saying, you're not worthy of us. But listen to God's evaluation. He says this in verse 38. Okay? He says, men of whom the world was not worthy. So the world is saying, we want you out of here. You're not worthy to be here. God says, the world wasn't even worthy of these men. Completely different. So what we see here now, it's totally reversed in heaven. God's opinion. All right? Wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. So let's go back to verse 37. It says, they were sawn in two. Okay? According to what we know, that was Isaiah the prophet. They took him and sawed him in half when he was still alive.
Yeah.
I remember that.
That's pretty horrible.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty horrible. And he wrote, 66 chapters in the book of Isaiah. One of the most magnificent books you can imagine. Okay? And his reward, as far as the world was concerned, was we're going to saw you in half. Okay? But I just don't think he is regretful of the way he lived right now in heaven. I don't think he regrets it. Okay, verse 27. But I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. All right? And that word for love is agapao, or what we know as agape love. And it would have to be that because it would have to be from God, right? Mm-hmm. Bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. Wow. That's a little hard.
Very hard.
Whoever hits you on the cheek, offer him the other also. Whoever takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from him either. Give to everyone who asks of you. Whoever takes away what is yours, and do not demand it back. Treat others the same way you want them to treat you. Of course, that's called the golden rule. Now, the Jews had a saying at that time. Or actually, in the rabbinic writings, they had this, another thing, which was, do not do to someone what you don't want done to you. Okay? Which is a good thing to say, right?
Right.
But now Jesus goes the extra mile and says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You see how he exceeds that? Okay. For if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. Now, when he says sinners, you say, well, we're all sinners. He's talking about what they consider the scum of the earth, the tax gatherers, the harlots and all that, okay? He's saying, if you just love those who love you, seriously, we get together, have little outings, and we love those people who say good things about us and treat us good, right? He's saying, what credit is that to you? The sinners do the same. What he's saying is he's really lifting the standard way up here, isn't he? He's saying, no, that's not good enough. He says this in verse 34, if you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners in order to receive back the same amount. All right? Again, a higher standard. But love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. Okay? Now, that's talking about interpersonal relationships. So if I go to Donnie's bank, okay, and he lends me some money, he has a business, well, then you have a business, you would expect, you know what I'm saying, me to pay back and pay a little bit of interest. That's talking about personal business. If I'm really down and stuff and Donnie comes, here, brother, and he gives me like $100. In that case, it might apply. Okay. As opposed to like, it's interpersonal relationships in the second example. You see what I mean? As opposed to like having a business or something. Does that make sense? You guys see what I'm talking about? So it depends on how you apply this, but it's more an attitude he's telling us to have. And here is where it all culminates, okay? Verse 36. Be merciful just as your Father is merciful.
But
that's the overlying principle.
Okay. But if you have somebody that is in your life that they claim that they're a Christian and for all intents and purposes, I'm sure they are. You also are not to be their rug either. I mean, what's the one that we talk about? Even Jesus tells the
Pick up your, dust off your sandals and walk
Yeah.
away.
welcome in a home. Yeah,
Yeah.
he tells his.
But that's a whole different, I think, situation. In other words, see, again, it's properly applying the word, right? That's the whole thing. So there are times, say like he says, you know, if they don't receive your message and dust off your sandals and all that.
Right.
What that was a sign of, okay, because you reject my message, not so much rejecting me, but the message that they were sent out with, he says, we reject even the dust that clings to our sandals. Okay? As opposed to them personally doing you wrong. See the difference?
I do.
Okay, now it's tricky to apply it. I'd be the first to admit you have to take it on a case by case. But again, let's go back to the overarching principle. Luke 6:36. Here's what you apply across the board. Be merciful just as your Father is merciful. Okay? And when you look at how merciful God is to us, dirty, rotten sinners who have rebelled against him, that's a lot of mercy. And that's what he wants his children to portray. In other words, it's like father, like son. We have to apply it the right way. Like in war. Do I sit there and say, okay, enemy, I'm not going to shoot or kill anybody. You can just shoot and kill me.
Right.
See, it's a misapplication. You have a right to go to war for the right cause, okay? If someone breaks in here with a gun, I'm going to try to disarm them, okay? And I might get real violent or something, right? In order to do it, to accomplish my goal, in order to protect other people and myself, okay? Especially if I have my sons here. Is that a violation of this? No. It doesn't mean necessarily you lie down and let anybody do what they want to, okay? You have the right of self-defense and all this other stuff. Again, these are not easy issues. If somebody broke into the house where Donnie was, he'd have the perfect right to use whatever he needed to stop that, to prevent that, biblically speaking, period. The right of self-defense. Okay, doesn't mean he's going to say, okay, I'm not allowed to do anything. Oh, you're going to stab me? Okay, stab me on this side now, or something like that. It's not talking about that. To slap somebody in the face was a great insult, like spitting in the face. It's saying in interpersonal relationships, when you're personally wrong, then you be merciful and turn the other cheek. Okay? I know that's hard. That may not make it any better. But you see my point, right? And again, that I think will be the laws and the rules in the millennial kingdom. But by that time, there's very little crime and all that going on in the millennial kingdom. Ephesians, do not participate in the evil deeds of darkness, but even expose them. Okay? You have to take the whole counsel of God.
Okay.
The whole counsel. And again, we can go on all night. But let me go to verse 37. It says, do not judge and you will not be judged. Do not condemn and you will not be condemned. Pardon and you will be pardoned. Now, that's the only verse the non-believer can quote out of the Bible. Don't judge. Don't judge, right?
Mm-hmm.
You've heard not. But what's that really saying there, okay? Well, I do know the Bible tells us to judge. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 12 through 13. For what do I have, this is Paul talking to the Corinthians, for what do I have to do with judging outsiders? Do you not judge those who are within the church? He tells them they're judging those within the church. But those who are outside, God judges. Remove the wicked man from amongst you. In other words, in the church, you do judge people. They had court sessions and stuff and decided things and brought down sentences. Of course, we've gotten away from that. Okay? And what can you judge? Matthew 7, chapter 7, verses 16 and 18. You will know them by their fruits. Grapes are not gathered from thorn bushes, nor figs from thistles, are they? So every good tree bears good fruit, but the bad tree bears bad fruit. Okay? And then it says, a good tree cannot produce bad fruit, nor can a bad tree produces good fruit. So can you judge fruit? Yeah, you can judge fruit. He just got through saying that. He's saying, look at the fruit, and you can judge that. All right? There's only one thing that judges motives. It says the word of God in Hebrews 4 is sharper than any two-edged sword. You know, cutting between the, between the soul and the spirit and all that, between the joints and the marrow. In other words, it can judge your motivations. We can't always do that. But at the same time, if I'm going around murdering everybody, and you say, you shouldn't be doing that, I say, don't judge. Do you see how foolish that is?
Oh my
You can say,
goodness.
I can't judge your motives, but I can sure judge your actions. Right? I'm a murderer. And you know that no murderer has an inheritance in the kingdom of God. 1 Corinthians 6. So you can judge me and preach the gospel to me based upon the fruit of my life. Now, is that kind of making sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so do not judge, you will not be judged. Verse 37, do not condemn, you will not be condemned. Pardon, and you will be pardoned. Give, and it would be given to you. They will pour into your lap a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. For by the standard of measure, it would be measured to you. Now, what's the giving right there? It's mercy. And if you give mercy, you're going to receive mercy, is what he's saying. All right? Now, what's all that shaking together and all that other stuff? The measure in the marketplace, to get a little jar pot, they would shake it, where the grains would come down, you know what I'm saying? Where they could fill it. Then they would press it down, shake it some more, and then finally it was to the point where it's running over. And then the fold in your garment above your belt was your bosom. And then they would pour it into that. So you got the full measure what you paid for. So if you
For
got
carrying purposes? For carrying purposes?
yes, for carrying purposes. All right? So that's what it's referring to. It's not, now the name it, claim it teachers, the wealth teachers will tell you, well, that's talking about money and giving to their ministry and you're going to get a lot of money back. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with mercy in context. So you see the importance of reading things in context. Okay? Verse 39, and he also spoke a parable to them. A blind man cannot guide a blind man, can he? Will not both fall into a pit? And today, we have a lot of blind men that are guiding other blind men.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
It's
big
unfortunate.
time.
Just because somebody has a title from church, don't be fooled by that. That doesn't mean anything in and of itself. Okay? So blind, guiding the blind, we're full of that. Verse 40. A pupil is not above his teacher, but everyone after he has been fully trained will be like his teacher. Okay, so that's being a disciple of Jesus, and you could become Christ-like. But that also means if you're guided by the blind and trained by the blind, you're going to end up blind. Okay, so be careful. Verse 41, and we're coming near the end. Why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, brother, let me take the speck out of that is in your eye, and why do you not see the log that is in your own eye? Now, people stop there and say, see, you can't judge me on that because you got a log in your own eye, and I only have a speck. But Jesus doesn't say, then just leave it alone and never worry about it. Look what he says, second half of verse 42. You hypocrite. First take the log out of your own eye, then you will see clearly take the speck out of your brother's eye. So he's telling you, take the speck out of your brother's eye. He's not just saying don't do it. He's saying you can do it, but you got to take the log out of yours. And so he's telling you, get your life clean and then help your brother clean up his life. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, so he's not telling you not to do nothing. Verse 43, for there's no good tree which produces bad fruit. On the other hand, a bad tree which produces good fruit. Again, you're going to judge them by their fruit. For each tree is known by its own fruit, for they do not gather figs from thorns, nor do they pick grapes from a briar bush. The good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth what is good, and the evil man out of the evil treasure brings forth what is evil, for his mouth speaks that which fills his heart. Okay? So again, you can judge people by their fruit. So next time the non-believer quotes the only verse he knows. Judge not. Judge not. You know the correct application. That's what the Apostle Paul said. Don't you judge those within the church? Talking to the Corinthians. Of course they did. And in fact, it's impossible for you to go through one day without making at least a few hundred judgments. What do I make for breakfast? What do I wear? Okay, which route do I take to work? You see what I'm saying? Of course you make judgments. All right? So it's a specific kind. All right, so let's finish this off. Verse 46. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? Do you see the contradiction there? A Lord is someone, whether it's referring to God or some earthly master, is someone you unquestionably obey. He says it, that's what you do. And he's saying, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and don't do what I say? All right? So we hear a lot of, well, the good Lord said, or the good Lord told me to do. Well, you're not following God. Okay? You're not following God. Verse 47, everyone who comes to me and hears my words and acts upon them, I will show you whom he's like. He's like a man building a house who dug deep and laid a foundation on the rock. And when the flood occurred and the torrent burst against that house and could not shake it because it had been well built. But the one who has heard and has not acted accordingly is like a man who built his house on the ground without any foundation. The torrent burst against it and it immediately collapsed, and the ruin of that house was great. So no foundation. Okay, and in both cases, whether they had the foundation or not, the floods came. It's just the one that had the foundation of Jesus Christ is the one that stood. So to acknowledge God and to know how to speak Christianese doesn't do anything except make you what the Bible calls a hypocrite. That's all it does. That's all it does. But if you actually do what he says, then you can call him Lord. All right? Again, the fruit, the outbearing, your actions, your walk should be reflected. Which is why when people say, see, you just have to believe in the gospel. 1 Corinthians 15. Believe, that Jesus died for your sins, rose from... That's all you got to do is believe. But if you got to believe in such a way it changes your life. If it doesn't change it, then it's not any good.